All right, welcome everyone. We'll just spend a few minutes letting everyone join the Zoom room and get comfortable. I'll be doing a little bit of housekeeping and welcoming you all today. Very civilized time of the day to be having our webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar, Growing Food for Resilience. As you're probably aware, Sustain is hosting this webinar today, and my name is Fee McAllister. My pronouns are she, her, and my role at Sustain is coordinating London's food growing network, Capital Growth. I'm really happy to be here today, and huge thanks to my colleagues Maya and Bella, who've been working effortlessly to pull this webinar together for us all today. You'll have a chance to hear from Bella a little bit later on, and Maya will be very active in the chat too. It goes without saying that we're extremely grateful to all our contributors who you'll meet in just a moment. And of course, really grateful to Richard Choksey from Social Farms and Gardens, who will be chairing the conversation for us today. We'd rather be together in person for this event, but having said that, we really see the value in creating these online spaces from time to time, where giving people an opportunity to join from different parts of the country and share their experiences, but to give us a sense of who's in the room and also make the most out of the networking opportunities from events like today's. We invite you, if you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat and tell us a little bit about the food growing initiative that you're involved with, or indeed what brought you to this event today. If anybody needs any support with the Zoom, please signal to myself or my colleagues in the chat, and we'll do our best to help. And this is a good opportunity, a good time for me to mention that we're recording today's session, and myself and my colleagues will be sending the link to that recording in a follow-up email later this week. And if I may, before handing over to the lovely Richard, I'll just say a few words about our intentions for this space today. We'd really like everyone to feel this is a safe space, treat each other equitably and respect each other's perspectives and expertise. That goes including during our conversations and questions or in the online chat. We won't tolerate any kind of discrimination, and we're really looking forward to you helping us create a space where we can all listen and be heard and be respectful, be open to being challenged and to learning if we sometimes get it wrong. We value people's contributions, and we want everyone to contribute in whatever way you feel most comfortable. If you have any concerns, please get in touch with us. I'll also put my email in the chat in a moment in case you want to get in touch after today's event about anything, or if you think there's anything that we can do to improve. And ultimately, Sustain takes responsibility for this space. As such, today we're talking about community food growing and how communities are responding to the context of the cost of living crisis and building resilience. And I just wanted to recognise that within this conversation today, we're aware that we're lacking representation on the panel of lived experience of poverty. So we think it's really important for us to acknowledge that there's a missing piece of this conversation, both within this webinar, but also perhaps within the wider sector, and a reminder also of how urgent it is to dismantle some of the structural inequalities that exist and make it more challenging for folks with less cultural capital or confidence, and those that are facing income inequality, to have speaking roles at events like today's. With that in mind, I'm really looking forward to today's conversation and hearing about some solution-focused approaches and exploring the notions of solidarity and equity, but also looking at where the challenges and the barriers lie. I'll stop there and hand over to Richard Choksey, who I mentioned earlier is chairing today's event. Richard is a long-time plants person working in participatory green space to promote positive social change. He's delivered community food growing and nature engagement projects with Meanwhile Gardens, which is in North Kensington, and more recently with Black Roots in Haringey, based at Wolves Lane. He also works part-time with social farms and gardens, facilitating networking and training opportunities for city farms and community gardens across London. Welcome to Richard, who's going to kick off today's webinar. Thank you, Richard.
Thanks, Fee. And I'd just like to start by echoing the words that Fee said about ensuring this space is safe for everybody to express themselves, and also that we are open to holding space for a conversation around how we can make better access or give better platform for people who are directly affected by some of the problems and crises that we're discussing. So this webinar, we're here to launch Sustain and Capital Growth's Good to Grow Day, which will be later in the year, and you'll hear a little bit more about that shortly. Today we're going to be focusing specifically on how community gardens are promoting local resilience in the face of the cost of living crisis. This webinar was planned prior to the recent and continuing crisis of veg procurement that we're experiencing in our supermarkets, which just goes to show how pertinent the work that Capital Growth and all of us here are doing to address some of the absurdities of our current globalized food system. Not only do we lack any tangible connection with the people who produce our vegetables, which can hide awful living conditions and conditions of exploitation at the other end of our supply chains, we're also denied the opportunity ourselves of connecting with nature on a daily basis in a profound yet an entirely routine way by celebrating the food that's on our plate and understanding where it's been grown. So with that in mind, I'm really excited to be hosting this webinar, which brings together a wonderful range of speakers, from Hannah Maki, who is a practitioner, a community growing practitioner of many years, Gemma and Darren, who both coordinate networking projects that connect growers and consumers, and Andrea, who's been working alongside practitioners for a number of years, bringing an academic slant and helping people to tell their stories themselves. So before we get onto that, I'd just like to hand over to Bella, who's going to give a quick introduction of Good to Grow, and then we'll hear a little bit about the ongoing Right to Grow campaign, which is being currently coordinated by Prue. So Bella, if you'd like to take the reins.
Hi everyone, thanks for that, Richard, that's excellent. I'll just quickly share my screen to share a couple of slides with you all about Good to Grow Day. So if you bear with me. Fantastic. So yeah, hi everyone, I'm Bella. My pronouns are she, they, and I coordinate Good to Grow, which is Sustain's national network of local community garden networks. So we're a big national network of networks, which sounds really confusing, but is really fun. And if you would like to ask me any more details about that, then my email will be at the end of the presentation. And I'm just here to say that we're really pleased to announce that registration is now open for this year's Good to Grow Day. This is our national weekend of action. It's running from Friday the 21st until Monday the 24th of April this year. And it's for edible community gardens to celebrate spring, to open their doors to the local community, and to encourage people to volunteer in that space as well. So last year, thousands of people took part in Good to Grow Day across well over 100 sites spanning all over the UK. And nearly half of the gardens that took part had never run an event for Good to Grow Day before. So if you're sitting there and you're part of a community garden and you're wondering what this is, then don't worry, you're not alone. And it's a really good time to start and to take part. So I'll tell you a little bit more about what Good to Grow Day is. So last year, the gardens that took part ran a huge range of events, and that included garden tours, workshops, compost talks, seed sowing and planting orchard trees, family crafts, quizzes, kids activities, construction work, wood chipping, plant sales, plant shares, plant swaps, or just open days and chatting over a cup of tea and a slice of cake, as well as nature discovery sessions with kids and families. So it's loads of fun, and you can design events to suit your own garden, suit your own space and the number of volunteers you have. This year, we are going to be providing more resources than ever to help support your events. So, for example, in collaboration with the Royal Parks, my colleagues at Capital Growth, Fee and Maya, they've created 2 brand new guides on wildlife-friendly food growing and understanding the insect world. And to go along with these brilliant new guides, we've made bug count bingo cards for you to print and use in your gardens, which is a really fun way to help kids turn into citizen scientists for the day. We've also got specially designed colouring in sheets that can double up as posters for you to record how much carbon you're saving in your garden with the help of our harvestometer. We've got editable Instagram cards for you to share your carbon counts with your followers. And as ever, we've got a guide to jobs and activities, printable posters, postcards that you can personalize to advertise your events, anti-racism toolkit, template press releases, risk assessment template, social media guide and resources, and just absolutely loads more. So we've got a great kit to help you take part in this brilliant weekend of action. And of course, we're going to be having our annual photo competition. So all you need to do when you're running your events is to share your favourite photos for a chance to win £100 for your garden. You'll find out more information about that when you sign up. So just to give you a quick sense of why it's worth getting involved, we spoke to the gardens that took part last year, and more than 8 in 10 of them found it either useful or very useful for their projects to take part in this. And over 90% felt that Good to Grow Day was a really helpful way to provide more opportunities for people from different backgrounds to get involved in community growing. Gardens tell us that it's a great way to share knowledge, to promote their work, champion community growing all around, but also to make links with their local community and feel like part of a kind of wider network and a wider movement right across the country. So why not take part? I'll just quickly talk you through how you can sign up. If your garden is already registered to the Good to Grow network, simply log into your dashboard and sign up to Good to Grow Day by clicking one of these buttons that I've circled in green. And you can also see a link to our resource kit that I just talked you through in the middle there underneath help and support. Don't worry if your garden isn't yet registered to Good to Grow or Capital Growth if you're in London. It's quick, it's simple, and it's totally free. Plus, there are loads of benefits that you can read about on our website, like being visible on the Good to Grow map, which is a great way to recruit volunteers. And also you can use our harvestometer, where you can track your harvests, and that helps you find out how many meals you've contributed to, how much money that you're saving, and also how much carbon your community garden is potentially saving. So loads of great reasons to sign up to the network, and loads of great reasons to sign up to the event as well. I've popped the website there for how to join us, but I'll also pop a couple more links up now, and we will be sharing these slides after the webinar's finished, so you'll be able to click on those afterwards. So thanks for bearing with me. I hope you're all as excited as we are about Good to Grow Day. And now it is a pleasure to quickly hand over to our next speaker. Prue Elliott is a campaign consultant for Incredible Edible, and I'm really pleased to hand over to her for an update on the Right to Grow campaign. Thanks, Prue.
Thanks so much, Bella. Hi, I'm Prue, and I'm working with Incredible Edible on the Right to Grow campaign. I'm really grateful to the team at Sustain for finding a way to squeeze me into the packed schedule today for an opportunity to share some updates on the work that Incredible Edible has been doing around the issue of improving access to community growing spaces. So as many of you will know, there is a lot that needs to happen to increase the resilience of our communities through community growing, including support and training and increasing access to gardening for a diverse range of different people. And one challenge that we're working on at Incredible Edible is looking at the logistics of access to spaces for growing. There are a lot of councils in the UK where there is fantastic support, even if limited resources, for community food growing projects. But there are also parts of the country where access to land for community growing is restricted, it's challenging, and where councils, for various reasons, might just not be so supportive. And that's something that really needs to change. We really need a system that gives as many people and as diverse a range of people as possible access to land for growing if they want it. I think it's really interesting that at the moment, up and down the country, people are gardening on land that, legally speaking, they have no right to be gardening on, whether it's called guerrilla gardening or propaganda gardening or anything else you want to call it. It's happening all over the country, and I'm sure a lot of people on this webinar will be involved with those kinds of projects. But the problem is that not all people and not all communities can take the risks of being involved in these types of activities. We don't yet live in a place where all people are treated equally by our society and by our regulatory systems or our processes. And that means that while there are people who feel safe to go and build a raised bed on a verge near their block of flats and just start growing food, and that's fantastic, there's a lot of people who just can't contemplate something like that for a whole host of different reasons. I think it really doesn't make sense that a lot of people are in a position where the only way that they can garden is to do so technically illegally. It's gardening, it's feeding ourselves, and that feels so fundamental. So at Incredible Edible, we're working on securing legislation to give communities a right, which would be bound by law, to access and use publicly owned land for food growing projects without having to feel like they need to fight a council for permission or make the decision to go ahead and do growing without permission. And I'm not saying that if we just make land available, that will solve all the other systemic problems that stop communities from growing food, but it's one part of that process. So far, Incredible Edible has secured a proposal for an amendment in the Levelling Up Bill, which is passing through the House of Lords at the moment, for a right to grow, or I think the amendment's referred to as a right to community cultivation at the moment. And in short, the amendment would legally bind councils to map and provide access to public land, which is suitable for cultivation for community food growing groups. The access would be rent-free because it's disused and it's publicly owned land that we're talking about. And it would come with leases and insurance requirements that are simple and straightforward to navigate. Where we're at the moment is that we've got 4 sitting peers supporting the amendment, which is the full number that you can have for this part of the process. And the amendment is due to be debated, I think, next week at the committee stage. There's quite a lot of stages to get through, and it's far from an easy passage to get the legislation through. But Incredible Edible is currently building out plans for moving forwards with this, either in the Levelling Up Bill or through other means if the Levelling Up Bill amendments are not successful. We are at relatively early stages of devising the next steps. Really what's happened is we're grabbing an opportunity that's presenting itself through the Levelling Up Bill. So yeah, please stay tuned, and we hope to be able to share more about this, other events relating to community food resilience in the future. And I'll just finish up by saying, if anyone would like to discuss this with me more, perhaps in relation to projects you're involved in, challenges you've faced using public land, or anything really in relation to this, I'll drop my email in the chat and you can contact me. I'm really open to have conversations with different people involved in this area and considering access to land. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Hi, Prue. Hi, everyone. Thanks for that really great summary of what's happening. Really exciting with Incredible Edibles Right to Grow campaign. So I am the Capital Growth Project Officer working alongside Fee. And like I said, name is Maya. And I just wanted to share a couple of Menti questions. So I'll be popping in the chat a direct link so that you can fill out. There you go. The following questions we thought would be interesting to get a feel for who's in the room. I know in the intro, Fee ended up sharing a little bit about asking where people were from, but it would be nice to put together a bit of a word cloud. So I'm going to share my screen and hopefully everybody will be able to see that. Oh, great. Okay. I'm just going to put it in present mode. Amazing. Okay. Right, so we've got definitely across the UK, we've got Edinburgh, Cambridge, London represented quite well. So the size of the different locations as well are basically linked to the number of people also from those areas. So that's really great to see. Amazing. Reading, Buckingham, Milton Keynes. That's fab, especially since the Good to Grow campaign is a UK-wide campaign. So on that note as well, as this is coming through, we had a second question, which perhaps you have gotten to, which is in a few words, what makes your food growing initiative space project resilient? And it would be really great if people could just pop into this as well. Perhaps a couple of key points that they feel makes or stands out in terms of making their space resilient. And in your way of interpreting that word as well, just to kind of see it isn't yet okay, and why isn't it is also an interesting question. What would make it resilient? I guess is what social networks, that's great. Community supports, fantastic. Sustainability, partnerships with local people and organizations, yes. Long-term funding, great. Working with the community from the beginning, diversity of participation, incredible. Wow, look at that. Multi-agency working, common vision, having long-term access to the land, yes, also important. Local buy-in, fantastic. Diverse range of crops funding, diversity of support from volunteers, good existing infrastructure, part of a larger umbrella organization, local enthusiasm, connections, yes, that's incredible. Okay, I hope you're all enjoying this as much as I am, seeing everyone's comments come in. And this can keep going throughout the webinar as well. So feel free to keep sending those through. I think at this point, amazing. So we have learning from others, sharing knowledge and experience, encourage local economies, involving communities and building on strengths. That's really great. Okay. Well, thank you for that. I think I will then pass it back to Richard so we can keep this webinar going and get ready for the exciting panelists.
Thanks, Maya. And really exciting to hear all of those responses to that last question. And it really goes to show how there is like a cohesive, there are some cohesive ideas of what we're here to do and how as a grassroots movement, we can mobilize all the wonderful assets within our communities to address global changes rather than relying on state actors who are often idle to do those on our behalf. So really inspiring to hear those responses. So we're going to go ahead and and begin hearing from our speakers. Our first speaker is called Gemma Burley. Gemma is a self-confessed sustainable foodie. She loves cooking, growing and eating, and the power of food to bring people together. She is head of programs at Cambridge Sustainable Food Community Interest Company, which is the lead organisation for the city's food partnership. Gemma works on a variety of projects and programs with residents and organisations, and in her spare time is a keen allotmenteer. So Gemma, please tell us more about your work in Cambridge.
Thanks, Richard. Hi, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen. I've got a couple of slides for you, mainly pretty pictures, I'll be honest. So joining you today to chat about Grow a Row, which was a campaign that we launched back in the start of the pandemic. My colleague Louise, I believe, is also on the call, who is one of the initiators of this project. And this really came about at the start of the pandemic when everyone was worried about many different issues, including food supply. And at the start of the pandemic, we worked with lots of neighbourhood groups, community organisations, the City Council, mutual aid groups, to establish 9 community food hubs in the city, which was where people who were struggling for whatever reason could access food for free. And as part of that process, we were thinking about how can we get fresh fruit and veg into the city, and that's where Grow a Row was born. We were really so privileged to have such an outpouring of support from volunteers and organisations, businesses in the city who are really showing solidarity with people in our city that were struggling during the pandemic. And the hubs have continued to operate and been shaped with and by the people that visit them, and they're continuing today and still going strongly. So I thought I'd take you through the kind of the nuts and bolts of the project, really, which might be helpful in your areas too. And I'm looking forward to hearing also about other projects around the country. So at the beginning of the pandemic, we thought about how can we get the message out about this idea of Grow a Row. The idea is to encourage individuals, allotments, streets of people, schools, organisations to plant some extra fruit and veg that they can grow and then donate to the community food hubs. So we got the message out in various ways through our website, social media, newsletters, you name it. And we developed some resources as well on our website and pointed people to some of the great stuff that's out there already to try and encourage people to get involved. And we were absolutely overwhelmed with responses and by the generosity of people to get involved and grow food for the food hubs. We had a local school, Newnham Croft Primary School, growing food by some of their pupils, potatoes and blackcurrants. We had an organisation called Co-Veg, a farmer planting up 2 fields of produce for the food hubs and working with the community to grow it as well. We had a community allotment getting involved who used an extra piece of land that they planted up for donations. And we managed to get lots of different allotment holders in different areas in touch with each other so they could coordinate dropping off food to their local hub. We had a local farm, Fennon Farm, involved, as well as the local charity Headway, who use a garden to help people with rehabilitation after brain injury. Tons of amazing fruit and veg coming through. We had somebody cycling a 17-kilo pumpkin in on their cargo bike, a couple that lived next to an orchard bringing in 20 kilos of plums a day for 2 weeks. So all sorts of just fantastic and gorgeous produce and gorgeous people as well coming through and getting involved. Over the last 3 years, it's equated to around 5 tonnes of food that's been produced and donated through Grow a Row. And going out to people in the city that need it. The project has just been such a lovely way to engage with the community, and it's been really inclusive, and anyone can get involved, whether they have a spare windowsill or a garden or an allotment. Sorry, my cat's keen to join us. We have been really overwhelmed by the solidarity that people have been showing through the campaign and continue to get involved. And it's been as well clearly a really nice way to get food into the city that's locally and sustainably produced. And we've had some really interesting feedback from the people visiting the hubs. And 48% of those people we chatted to were really interested in learning how to grow food themselves. So as we move forward and think about what's next, we're looking at how we can bring communities together around growing more, and so share some of the skills we have in the community to help people to grow together in their local areas. And we're, as I speak, kind of getting things in motion for this year, the Grow a Row campaign. And you can find some links there to some of the resources that we put together to help people to grow at home and further afield. And if there's any questions or anything you'd like to chat about, do drop me a line. It'd be great to have a chat. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Bella. Wonderful, wonderful to hear about your work. Now we're going to hear from Darren Squires, who is currently Veg City's Community Campaign Officer. He has worked as a community arts facilitator for over 20 years, before that being a vegetarian chef. He is also a teacher, filmmaker, and has produced and presented for television. Darren passionately believes that well-cooked meals made from good raw ingredients are what constitute good food, and that vegetables play a central role in proper meals. So Darren, yeah, take it away.
Excellent. Right. So this is going to be a bit of a speed run because I've got quite a lot of technical stuff to get through. But just to start off with, with this project, we're not trying to tell people how to do their jobs or give people solutions without thinking about what they need. What we've done is we've been speaking to community growers and community kitchens and community food distributors, listen to the things they've been talking about, and then trying to find a technical solution. And I've got to say, you might see this as well, that I think some of the ideas from Grow a Row are going to be incorporated into the way we actually deliver this. But these are the issues we're addressing and the solutions we're looking for. We've got what looks like a fantastic opportunity in the growing season. Community gardens, allotments are bursting with veg and they're desperate to give it away. So the solution seems quite straightforward. We gather all of this surplus food, we give it to community food distributors. This is one from a school that I work in, and we've got a fantastic veg offer for the people that are taking this food. But one of the issues we came across is it can overwhelm these organisations because there's a lack of choice sometimes. It is surplus. So we are dealing with gluts. The type of veg that we get sometimes is something that is, it takes a while to get people used to using this veg, and we could do with the chance to work with the members. However, it's a hard enough job working with fair shares. This is probably not even the weirdest thing I've seen fair share give out, but the idea that we've got to convince people to take a bag of ungutted sardines home to cook with, whilst at the same time trying to deal with veg that, let's face it, it comes in the morning. We've got to get it out in the afternoon because it's perishable. So I have seen veg being thrown away literally by people that are not sure how to use it. And this is not a problem. The problem that the organizations have isn't they don't know how to engage, or that they don't have the confidence, or they don't have the mechanisms for making sure this veg offer is a genuine offer. The issue is that they're being back-footed by getting food in that they're not sure what's going to arrive or when it's going to arrive. So what I've looked for is, this is something that I actually started building years ago when I was a chef, or designing years ago when I was a chef, to enable chefs to decide what food they got in, so they could get high quality, locally grown, and interesting veg onto the plates of customers. And I've adapted it to work with community, in a community setting, in a third sector setting. So what we're looking to build, or what is about to be built, is a digital online platform where the growers, and it can be allotments, it can be community growers, it can be community gardens, and that tertiary sector, community kitchens, food distribution, social supermarkets, they can get together, they can plan and organise the distribution of the food. So the growers can put out there what they're growing, what they're able to grow, what kind of harvest time frame they've got for the stuff that's planted, what kind of quantities they can provide. If it's something where they want to donate, they can say whether they're donating. If they want to sell, they can give a price, and they can talk about transport. Are you able to deliver, or is it going to have to be picked up? The food distributors, an important one, this is completely vital, and this is, I think, what the reason why I built it in the first place. They can say what they want, what they can use, because then they can feed back to the growers and get the growers to grow what they know they can use, their use time frame, their quantities, if they're going to take donations, or whether they're in a position to pay if they have any transport issues. So the idea is then all of the organisation, all of the planning can be done. This isn't going to do it for them, but they can get together and they can make decisions based on being able to find each other. the thing we got to be completely honest, this is not going to solve everything. It's going to solve a few things. And it's like, for example, that last minute delivery of veg should go out the window because there will be advanced notification. So there will be more control. It should limit the waste that then happens when members aren't taking the veg that's being offered. Things that it can't address directly, things like the transport and the logistics. It can't decide on whether there's sales or donations or how sustainable the food systems are because of this. And it can't solve on its own any issues around the uptake of veg. But if we just dig a little bit deeper into that, if you can get ultra-local growers and distributors together, you've got an ultra-local delivery system. So maybe some of this can be done by bike or by wheelbarrow. And if there are logistical issues to be dealt with, at least we've identified them and we can either find our own solutions or we can ask for funding to achieve those solutions. In terms of sustainability, we can give a purpose and a structure to a voluntary project in terms of applying for funding and demonstrating a social good, or recruiting volunteers and demonstrating what the social good is, who is taking this food, this fresh food, and how it's being used. And if there is some kind of a social market within this, then there's a chance of creating a sustainable, some sustainable delivery from some non-profit organisations. And in terms of the uptake of veg, this is a barrier, and I'm just addressing that barrier because talking to the organisations that I've spoken to, they have solutions, they have ideas, they have mechanisms. It's just they need to be able to plan in advance how they're going to deliver those. And finally, where we are at the moment, we're just getting a beta version built. That'll be ready at the end of the month. We've got half a dozen organisations from both sides of the logistics that are going to get on board and work together. We're going to trial it for this growing season, and then funding permitting, we're at the moment just waiting to hear back from funding. We can then implement a secondary version of it and expand it for another growing season, at the end of which, if it works, if it is a solution that people want, we are going to give ownership over to the community organisations, so they'll own it in a cooperative, in some sort of cooperative structure. And that is the end of my presentation. I hope I didn't force feed you too much information.
No, Darren, that was brilliant, and so great to hear a practical solution to one of the many problems that we're currently facing as a food industry. As you say, no one project can solve all of the problems, but collectively, perhaps with collective action, we can attempt to address the monumental task that faces us. So the next speaker is Hannah-Lee McKee. And she's going to tell us about her experiences as a practitioner of community food growing. Hannah is a community food grower and organizer in London. She has worked in urban food and community projects for over 10 years, including growing organic salad for box schemes, running a therapeutic gardening project, and working with schools. She is the community grower for Granville Community Kitchen, a food justice project in Kilburn, northwest London, which runs community meals and a sliding scale veg box with culturally appropriate options for the local communities. So Hannah, please tell us more about your experiences.
Thanks, Richard. Yes, so there's Bella has my slides, I think. Yes, there we go. So with the Granville Community Kitchen, and these is just some pictures of some of the food that we grow, cook and distribute. I'm going to actually just read out our mission statement because we did quite a lot of work on kind of vision and strategy recently. So we've all put our energy into this description of what we do, which is from seed to plate, we learn and grow together to build community relationships and collective power. In this way, we transform ourselves, our communities and our food systems to create a just, resilient and sustainable world. That is what we're going for. So we've got these 6 key themes, which are all quite big and interrelated as the world is. So it's about building community, making good food accessible, building power, creating kind of good jobs within the food system, education and learning, and holding an alternative holding and creating alternative stories and narratives, and that is alternative to the kind of dominant cultural narrative about society and economics and food and all of that sort of stuff. Cool. So on the next one, that's just like a quick roundup of our current projects. So some pictures from the community meals, or the current projects slide anyway, if that's the one. So we've got urban mini market gardens and the good food box. And we're also working on, there it is, thanks. And yeah, we're also working on some other pieces, which is about community education, action research, and looking for land, which is a sort of long-term project that we have to scale up. Our food production, community art classes, and the good food box. Yes, that's some of the stuff there. And then I thought I would put a bit of time into talking about some of the risks and challenges. So these are all quite big things I put on there. Regeneration and development, that's a big one for us in Kilburn, because there's been a very, very intensive regeneration process over the last 15 years in South Kilburn that's basically knocking down and building up all of the social housing and causing a lot of damage as they do. And so a lot of GCK's work over the last few years has been kind of advocating for that community space and trying to, challenging the regeneration and the kind of displacement of communities that can often happen, and yeah, doing our best to work against that. So yeah, that's a challenge, and I'm sure lots of other people in other cities and other areas feel as well. Similarly, working with councils and developers. So we're working with councils and developers because of the regen, and there's lots about it that are very challenging. It's just normally a kind of David and Goliath situation when you're a small organisation with like high values and political framing. And yeah, things that can happen with greenwashing, like a lot of people and developers and different agendas really like kind of co-opting the good work that we're all doing with the food production and stripping it out of its politics. So we talk a lot about keeping the political structural framing in very importantly, as well as what we're doing. Funding challenges, again, everyone will be familiar with this. Like, it's very hard to create a sustainable, resilient, genuinely resilient organisation within the perma crises that we're in this stage of history, and the precariousness of the funding that comes through, and the need to connect up with the funders' goals, and also the very interesting histories of lots of funders about how do big pools of funding accumulate with different people. There's a whole wider political structure there. And yeah, the paternalistic charity lens I've written, I've spelt lens wrong there, apologies. That was maybe autocorrect. But yeah, which is, again, I think something that a lot of the projects that we're talking about are trying to work on disrupting, but the traditional charity model in this, in this country has been very kind of paternalistic, and is very deeply rooted within the existing inequalities. There's a perception and a socio-economic reality of like who is in a position to offer kind of help and support and sharing resources that people don't have. Why don't people have the resources? All of that wider reasoning about the stuff that we're living in, and that's something that happens a lot with food, because we have a food waste problem, and we have inequity problem, and we have a food access problem, and a lot of people have added up the two, and so we do have a lot of work that has material useful outcomes in terms of the fact that people get food, but is quite challenging. Our founder Dee Woods calls it surplus food for surplus people, which is, I think it's a risk that we really need to be aware of, that actually if you're collecting up waste food and you're distributing it to people, that's not only just a sticking plaster, but has really problematic dynamics. Also capacity and burnout, that's just a kind of real awareness again for everyone that we're talking about. The grassroots sector and the organisations, the voluntary sectors, we all operate on giving a lot and within a really toxic political system, and so actually capacity of staff and volunteers really fluctuates, and people are often struggling under really difficult circumstances in many ways, that makes it hard to have energy to put into these projects that could help in the long term. Similarly, the cost of living and the rent crisis. So obviously we're thinking about how to challenge the cost of living crisis, or get food to people, but also we suffer from it because staff, volunteers can't you know, can struggle with rent and people leave London, all of this sort of stuff. So that's like some of the difficult things there. But on the next slide, I wanted to do a little, just expand a bit more into this idea about food banks. So with GCK, we set up emergency food aid, as lots of people did during COVID. There was a lot of funding and resourcing available suddenly, but for us, so we're very clear that handing out food in this way is an emergency response. It can't, and it shouldn't be a stable part of infrastructure, because that's the voluntary sector and all of people's goodwill kind of propping up the cruel impacts of the government's political decisions. So we are food aid rather than food banks, part of the international food aid network, which is again working on that solidarity, not charity model. And yes, just the fact that poverty is political. We've got here some of the campaigning that we've been involved with. Food and Farming March, you can see asking for the end the need for food banks, and a bit of a wider look at the food system. Working for the Right to Food campaign, again, Dee's been really instrumental on that. And yeah, just that this campaign to enshrine the right to food in law, because hunger is a political choice and we've got to be wary of applying sticking plasters if that's ignoring the wider system. It's also very challenging to do that. So in our situation, one of the things that this meant was that we wrapped up the food aid, apart from to certain people who are like so vulnerable and so left out of the system, that like we are keeping supplying them with food and delivering to them, but moving away from that as a model and setting up the Good Food Box, which is more about trying to create systems that increase community power around food, and restarting up again the community meals, which had to pause during COVID, which is again, people have access to food, but they also have access to the community, and we all eat together, and that's a very different dynamic to kind of giving out a food bag. This is the Good Food Box, and I can go into details if anyone has any technical questions about it, but I think that's probably running up to the end of the time, really. I guess I'll say one more thing, which is just that one of the challenges at the moment is that on the next slide, actually, you can see that our start prices, which is the lower priced veg box scheme, which is pegged to the Healthy Start vouchers, and we accept Healthy Start vouchers. That's really gone up. You can see since last year all the different reasons for that, and also that it's challenging because we need to get more funding in. Sorry, there's a lot of noise going on outside where I am, but I think that's the end now, so I'll stop that there. Sorry.
Terrific, thank you, Hannah, and thank you for bringing the keeping the political framing relevant to this conversation. And I think I hope there's an opportunity to continue that discussion after the presentations. So our final speaker is Andrea Berardi. Andrea is inspired by systems thinking to apply holistic, accessible, visual and participatory methodologies to support communities and decision makers in working through complex local challenges. His main interests lie in facilitating grassroots approaches to ecological sustainability and social justice. He currently works as a part-time senior lecturer at the Open University, entirely focused on supporting community-led research. He also is a volunteer co-director of the Cobra Collective Community Interest Company, a social enterprise which provides training, undertakes research and implements projects in order to promote community-owned solutions. And finally, in May 2022, he was also elected by his community to represent them as an independent councillor with the Runnymede Borough Council. So he's managed to find time amongst all those varying roles to speak to us today. So Andrea, yeah, take it away.
Thank you very much. I think that introduction were almost as long as my talks. Apologies for that. So yes, I want to take a slightly different angle and focus more on the stories that we tell each other to promote community food growing. So we've heard about various roles so far, the key ingredients that makes a successful community food growing initiative. You need coordinators, you need growers, fundraisers, motivators, networkers. Prue talked about policymakers. You need innovators, you know, the example of the tool to share resources. You need researchers, but also you need storytellers, right? So this is a project that we ran for about 18 months, and it's really fantastic to see in the list of participants a couple of individuals that participated in this project. And our idea was to promote flourishing communities through storytelling on community food growing, and specifically to capture what happened during the COVID pandemic. And that was a really traumatic experience for everybody, but it also brought communities together and opened up new opportunities of having flourishing communities. And one of these was a huge push towards community food growing. And the problem with these historic events is that everybody's involved in the moment, and then, like has happened, we get back to business as usual, and very quickly that memory is lost. So we wanted to do a digital storytelling program to capture those stories. And we use Frederick the Mouse as an example, where you've got all the little mice rushing around during summer, being very busy, collecting food, and then the winter hits and they're eating their food. And during this whole process, you got Frederick just sitting there observing, watching what the others are doing. And the others are a little bit grumpy about that because, you know, they're doing all the hard work. But actually, Frederick comes into his own because during the cold winter where everything's gloomy, Frederick tells the story of the whole process of food collection and, you know, how everybody chipped in, and that re-energizes the mice for the next growing season. So it's absolutely essential that we have storytellers within our community food growing initiatives. So a little bit about the project that we did. This was during the COVID pandemic, so it was entirely online. We had 3 different cohorts of participants, and we had about 4 training sessions, and every training session we upped the skills and techniques that people had to go and try out in their community food growing. They started off with just a photo story, like a photographic slideshow, and then that evolved into a narrated slideshow. So you still had your pictures, but then there was a voiceover underneath. And finally, when we introduced videos, we used an action research cycle. So we learned from participants' experience, and then so that in the next cohort, we were, you know, a little bit more effective in our approach. And crucially, we really stuck to very simple technologies: a mobile phone, tripod, and a cheap 10 quid microphone. We wanted to make the storytelling as accessible as possible. So most people have a smartphone, used open source software for capturing the stories and editing it, and yeah, and a few cheap accessories. During the training, we also put together a free online course. So I'll put that in the chat at the end of my little bit. And so there's a whole course on how to create digital stories for your community food growing. It's hosted by the Open University, but it's free. And so, you know, a little bit about what makes a great story for your community food growing. You know, make it personal, present challenges and solutions, make it a cathartic experience. By recording it, you create a social memory for your group. We heard how a lot of community food growing initiatives have high turnover, and often when you have you know, experienced individuals moving on, you lose that amazing social memory of the group's history, of, you know, what grows well in your locality, of, you know, how adversity was overcome, from, you know, from people to, you know, slugs and droughts and heat waves. And so it's absolutely crucial to record these experiences so that they can be passed on to the next group of participants. And then it can be a powerful tool for reaching out, inviting others. You know, posting these stories on social media to bring more people into the fore. And this is a little bit of how we encourage people to tell their story, set the scene, where are we, use a panoramic shot, and then zoom into the challenge, make it exciting, and then finally have a resolution and where to go next. So that's what makes a great story. And we also wanted it to be a positive stories, encouraging, inviting. So we encourage people to think of the theme of community flourishing and also radical hopefulness. We are in desperate times, but we also need to not abandon hope and present positive stories. So in the end, our participants, it was tough, right? We had over 40 participants and about 23 stories were produced in total, digital stories. So, it's not for everybody, and there's a lot of pressures that people have, but actually what is amazing is that we have so many amazing stories. So these are available on Vimeo, on a showcase, and I'll share the links to these stories too. And yeah, I've talked about the course already. And now where next? So we've, sorry, I'm jumping ahead. We produce a really amazing, rich report too, which is on the Cobra Collective website that tells you about the process, the outcomes and analysis of the stories that were produced, and have all the links to the course, the showcase and other materials. And yes, and where next? This is the really, really exciting new phase of this project to promote community food growing through digital storytelling. So we've been awarded funding from the Community Knowledge Fund. This is for phase 1. And the idea is that, yes, okay, we've built a mechanism for creating these exciting stories, but can we use these in a more powerful way? So Prue at the beginning talked about policy change from the top, trying to push legislation through Parliament so that there is greater access to community food growing. We're instead, with this new project, working from the bottom up. We're going to create these videos with our growing network of community food growing initiatives and use these as in a process called video mediated dialogue. So go and talk to decision makers, councillors, council officials, and say, here's a video of our aspirations, our challenges, what we're hoping to do with this land. What are you going to do about it? How are you going to support us in doing this? And then we will follow that dialogue backwards and forwards using video to underpin the lobbying from the bottom up. So phase 1 involves Reading, partners there, the Reading International Solidarity Centre, and partners from London, the Climate Emergency Centre in Staines, and a couple of community food growing initiatives in Surrey. And then phase 2, we're hoping to really scale things up. So please do get in touch, and we'd love to involve you in our digital storytelling initiative.
Thank you, Andrea. I found your phrase moving from the panoramic and to zooming in to the local and seeking to establish a resolution, a really powerful way of framing what brings us all together, because the movement seeks to address genuinely global challenges that are affecting us on a day-to-day basis and are compounding indeed. As Hannah mentioned, we do seem to be in a state of perma-crisis as a direct result of the current political and economic conditions that are actively reproduced by the decision makers in our society. And so what makes the projects that we're here to celebrate so brilliant is that they are genuinely offering an alternative with it adjacent to the current system, and yet still somehow managing to survive despite the adversity that we face. So I think at this point, it'd be great to move on to some questions. So if the panelists would all like to join me, and perhaps we can unpack some of the questions. Panelists, if you'd like to turn your cameras on. Yeah, so there were a number of really great questions. I did spot one at the start, which I think was covered, but I feel that some of the panelists may be well placed to discuss it, particularly Hannah, as due to Granville's recent experiences, and also Prue in terms of how it relates to right to grow. So Georgina Edwards highlighted their work managing the first database of assets of community value, and wanted to know, Prue, how do you think the ideas of community right to buy and community ownership of shared assets, how does that relate to right to grow? And then perhaps, Hannah, you could talk about some of your thoughts on accessing land and the challenges and perhaps the opportunities.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really grateful to Gemma for bringing that up. Sorry, no, it wasn't Gemma. I've forgotten the name. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to having a conversation about that, because I think that there's a lot of work still to be done to really work out what a mapping system would look like in practical terms, because there's a lot of existing examples of mapping of public land. There's some really great projects happening that are looking at how that can work and what it can actually deliver in terms of engagement from communities. So to be honest, I think it's at quite an early stage at the moment. And I also think it's going to have to be quite flexible, because I think one of the issues for anything where you're trying to map large chunks of land, particularly stuff that's owned by councils, is that just the sort of internal kind of bureaucracy within councils and knowing who owns what land and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's going to have to be a really flexible process.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always going to differ for different projects, and we're all resourced differently in terms of our time and the economic capital we have available. So it's but I suppose having these conversations does reinforce the urgency of the problem. Hannah, would you like to share any of your thoughts?
Sorry. Yeah, so in terms of the challenges of kind of looking for land or staying on land sustainably, well, yeah, I guess because for us there's two different strands. So one is just the kind of urban market gardens. So the brief story is that our garden outside the Granville, eventually, after years of back and forth, has now been knocked over, put behind a hoarding, and they were supposed to be building on it last summer, and then they didn't, and they've given us another site that which we're trying to set up. But again, it's very complicated because we're trying to work with councils and developers, and it's not as easy as it should be or could be or whatever. So that's one thing. And obviously, like, just in being involved in various urban growing projects over the years, just seeing lots of, so many like rest in peace community gardens that have like been lost or bulldozed or whatever. And I guess on the wider level, yeah, we are looking for some land in the peri-urban or just outside London range to scale up, and that's also very challenging, even though we were very lucky to have to be in a position that we had resources through a funder, and we had the kind of skills and the experience and stuff. Still, just the kind of structural inequities of just like in terms of us being like in terms of perhaps some of the makeup or the politics of our approach, I'm not really sure, but like there's a lot. What I notice is that there's a lot of like face value kind of saying like the right things, or like the buzzwords, or like everybody's kind of like, including funders and interested in this idea of like diversity and of like challenging the food system, but when actually the reality of that is actually quite it's a lot for people with a lot of power and resources to actually do that, because that means giving up their power and resources. And so when it comes to it, our experience has been, unfortunately, that it's sometimes you just can't have access because of various reasons, and sometimes you think you can because of the way people are talking, but then the kind of economic realities of it don't actually support the stuff that people say they want to support. don't know if that's a good answer or not.
Yeah, no, that's thanks for that intervention. I think it's great to hear from your experience that it is still incredibly challenging to make these spaces viable in the current context. So on that theme of diversity and meaningfully representing the people, your stakeholders, there is a question from an anonymous attendee for you, Hannah. You mentioned culturally appropriate veg and fruit in the boxes. Are you growing this on site, or are you buying in additionally some with are you buying in additional ones? And if you could just define culturally appropriate food as well, that would be great.
Sure. So culturally appropriate food, I'll start with that. It's the factor, it's about diasporic peoples having access to foods that are traditional to their countries of connection, basically. So one of the reasons potentially why veg box schemes tend to be not very diverse in terms of who gets on them, in terms of like who's getting that access to the regular veg and who for whom it works, and a lot of that is about seasonality and about the fact that actually if you're so I mean, I'm going to talk in specifics. So basically we're talking about like yam and okra and plantain and chocho, which is stuff that for our local like there's a local Afro-Caribbean community that's like very kind of well established in Kilburn, and if we offered a veg bag that just has Northern European veg in it, even though that includes, it can include certain things like chilies, for example, is a great thing that you can grow in this country really, really well, and that taps into loads of different cultural areas, because like loads of people all over the world grow chilies, and that's a really good thing that you can grow easily. But things like things that you need actually a different kind of a climate for, so we buy those in, and we supplement with stuff like again, as I'm sure most growers will know, like callaloo is basically the one thing that you can grow in this country like fairly straightforwardly. So callaloo is it's kind of amaranth. It's a leafy green that is also used in a dish, callaloo, across a lot of the Caribbean. So and this question of okra and plantain, I've never heard of anyone trying plantain. Okra you can grow if you've got a greenhouse and if you've got heated propagation space, basically. So there are certain things that you could grow in a really long season. Like if you had a really top-notch sunny spot and a really perfect season, you could grow okra. It's hard to do a lot of those other stuff without heating. And I think when you get into, there's also this, we kind of want to question this assumption that like good food has to be like food that we've just grown here really locally. I mean, obviously I'm all for local food for so many different reasons, but also I'm all for like really good international networks with other communities across the world, and that's part of the cultural aspect as well, is that we're not saying, oh, let's, sometimes people who I don't agree with politically will also agree with me that we should grow local food in the UK, and we should grow British food for British people. So there's a narrative that can go into that we don't like and that we think we should be really explicit against. So we're not, so we buy in stuff, basically. We buy in stuff that we need, and we grow what we can within the season restrictions.
Yeah, thanks for that. And just briefly, Hannah, I wonder your thoughts on like maybe introducing analogues for tropical crops. So for instance, I've heard of a species of yam, edible yam that grows in the mountains of Japan that's hardy down to something like -25 degrees Celsius. So I wonder, and callaloo is part of the broader spinach family, and can be used in the same way as something like tree spinach, or like the various amaranthacea species that we grow. So maybe you could share some thoughts on culture appropriate crops and analogues, and how those two meet each.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I never heard of that yam. It sounds great. Maybe you can tell me more about it later, because that sounds amazing. And also, like, because I know, Richard, at Black Roots, that you've got a glasshouse space, and I know Black Roots does a lot of work growing these sorts of crops, and actually with a like much better setup and more people than we do. So actually I feel almost like would want to hear from that experience of like what it's like trying to grow when you've got a proper glasshouse space. But the idea of analogues is super interesting, and also that it's not that like that's the other thing about community meals. If you're doing cooking, then you can like callaloo can be made with callaloo, but it can also be made with spinach, and it's about the way that it's cooked up with the chilies and the onions and stuff like that. And similarly, like obviously the world is full of people like adapting kind of traditional cultural recipes with the ingredients that there are around them. So actually that's another thing that's, you know, we try and have, we try and do a lot of we just try and bring in a lot of different people's experience, basically, because in the community meals and stuff, that's where the richness of that experience comes from. Like that's where people have used analogues, and they're using analogues to make dishes that they want to make, that are kind of have that connection. And so I think, but basically you just have to try all of it. And to be honest, what I find nowadays with climate change being so chaotic is that there's you don't know, you can try something and maybe it is actually going to work, because maybe you're going to get 4 months of drought and all your other stuff is going to grow, it's going to die, but like maybe that, you know. So I do feel that it's always worth trying it as well. It's always worth trying out these different things. And I think analog, I think that's an important part of it, to say actually we're going to bring in yams and plantains, but it's definitely not the only way to do it, because no one way is the only way to do anything, obviously.
Thank you, Hannah, and thanks for your extended period of answering my questions as a grower. Not that wasn't a criticism. I think perhaps as chair, I'm getting carried away. So the next question that I'm going to ask is on behalf of Mary Amelie. Is anyone aware of examples of concerted investment from a range of investors or funders into the food landscape at a community level, investment that would encourage a range of players, community-led as well as private and public sectors? And perhaps we can broaden that into a general conversation of how this work creating food resilience, local food resilience is funded. So any comments on that would be really appreciated. So would any of the other panelists like to start by perhaps going through how they are funded, or whether there is funding, and what that landscape looks like at present?
Sure. Hi, Richard. It's Gemma. So in terms of the Grow Row project, it's pretty low resource. So we kind of tend to use bits of project funding that we might get in from Sustainable Food Places or locally. In terms of kind of grander scale investment, I think it's a really interesting question. That I don't have any obvious examples that spring to mind. We have got a real kind of vibrant community sector and lots of big business in Cambridge, but I think there's still a lot of work that could be done to look at how we can sort of make the most of those relationships and potential community investment. I was just digging out the Cambridge City Council, some of the planning documents that we have around food growing, which includes consideration of food growing spaces in new developments. So whilst not so much about investment, as a kind of way of ensuring that food is taken into account in new developments in the city. See if I can find the link.
Maybe I could chip in here with my councillor hat on. So community food growing is an oddity, because it falls in between funding silos within councils. But the two key strategies where there is increasingly a lot of funding available is the climate change strategy and the health and well-being strategy within councils. So I think the challenge is not to maybe approach local authorities with, the community food growing, head on. It's about going sideways and seeing whether you could create a narrative within the climate change strategy or the health and well-being strategy that can access those resources. So it's thinking a bit laterally.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's a really good way of framing it, because this work provides a holistic solution to so many different problems. It can easily fall between the individual funds that are trying to solve each one. Darren, I wonder, given that your platform provides the opportunity for varying and diverse growers, like growing operations, to feed into distribution networks, Could you offer any thoughts on like, you know, this question of precarity in food growing and how essentially how people afford to have the time to grow veg? Are you able to speak to that in any way?
I think when you say have time to grow veg, well, the way we're looking at this working, at least in Hull, is there are going to be some in the community sense, some big players, in commercial sense, tiny players, but some organizations that can maintain the food system because they're growing enough food, they have enough volunteers, they have enough, not just funding, but kind of traded, you know, they have people that come in as volunteers, but they're from schools or colleges or organizations that are paying for that volunteer opportunity. And that's what's going to keep them going. And my hope or my assumption is that those organizations and some similar ones that are basically social enterprises on the other side, they keep the ecosystem going. And then if other people come in and even have to go out, there's still something for everyone else to lock into because there's something established and there's a method of and an expertise and a skill set that they can lock into.
Yeah, and that's the power of a networked approach, isn't it? Where you've got that resilience through diversity. And yeah, following from what you were saying, Darren, in terms of needing to have the kind of anchor organizations having existing funding to be able to supply food at scale, I suppose it just goes to show how important it is to engage with things like the Good to Grow Day and the community harvest network, because by engaging in these shared events and by participating, we can demonstrate how many people are interested in this, how much work is going into it, and with, for instance, the harvestometer, give tangible answers to questions around, you know, how much impact we're making on a you know, yield per hectare basis, which is really powerful. So yeah, I think around all of these questions is an encouragement to engage with the work that Capital Growth and Sustain are doing. So we have another question about security of tenure. So given the issues of security of tenure for community gardens and the tendency to become meanwhile spaces, isn't there a possibility to follow the allotment model to obtain statutory protections? Would anyone like to speak to that? I think perhaps Prue, you might have some thoughts in terms of how security of tenure can be ensured through the legislative mechanisms.
Yeah, so as for the right to grow as it currently stands, I believe it offers protection for 2 or 3 years, but you know, in terms of if you're thinking about perennials and things like that, all of that stuff's 3 years is nothing in the growing world, as we know. So I think this is an area that needs more work. I think one of the challenges is councils are under more and more pressure all the time from, you know, many different angles, and asking for really long chunks of tenure might just make this unachievable at this stage. But I'm not completely, I don't have a strong thought that that's not a changeable thing. So I'd be really open to having more conversations about what different mechanisms there might be for providing longer term protection for ongoing use of land. So if anyone wants to discuss that in more detail and what mechanisms might be workable and not absolutely terrifying to councils to think about having their land taken away from them for a really long time, please let me know.
Yeah, thanks. Anyone else with thoughts on this question of ensuring better security of tenure? We mentioned earlier community right to buy, and I suppose that would be the ideal if we have community ownership of shared assets. There are various problems, and I'm sure many of us are familiar with these problems. Primarily, community right to buy only ensures about the community 6 months to raise funding for the community asset under scrutiny, and in an urban environment where property prices are sky high, it's usually not realistic in terms of how how much resource needs to be pulled in to do those kind of things. So whilst there is that mechanism, that's obviously only going to work in very limited number of settings. There's a question here about nutrient density. Is anyone measuring or recording and promoting nutrient density as part of your projects? Understanding the difference in nutritional value between a local organic allotment carrot and a supermarket non-organic one, and other similar comparisons, is a really powerful storytelling, and is a powerful story to tell. So is anyone doing this work to measure nutrient content per kilogram?
One of the things around the structure of the exchange platform is that because the logistics of moving veg around and the economies of scale that supermarkets have, that's how they manage to undercut what we can sell locally. But what we can do locally is, it kind of doesn't matter if we grow something that mimics a supermarket carrot, or we produce a really interesting, really tasty carrot that takes longer to grow. So actually, locally growing should enable us, whether we decide to do it or not, should enable us to grow not just healthier but tastier veg locally, and almost to compete on a much more level playing field in terms of what we can deliver for the costs.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think sometimes it's hard to disentangle some of the various explanations for the difference in nutritional value. So historically, over the last 50 or 100 years, the nutritional content of all our vegetables has declined on average, but there are competing hypotheses as to why that is. One of them being the rise in carbon in our atmosphere, which, whilst we don't breathe it, that's a core constituent of photosynthesis. So essentially, plants are able to photosynthesize more, draw in more carbon, which dilutes the nutrients in the crop. So in some ways, climate change is good for plant growth, but it's bad for nutritional content. Which is not to say that I don't believe that organically grown food isn't superior. We all know from the taste test how much better an organically grown tomato is to one that's been overwatered and fed a nutrient solution its entire life. But yeah, it's sometimes difficult to disentangle some of the competing ideas as to why those differences pertain. We're getting towards the end of the webinar, but there are a few questions that were submitted in advance, which I think will be interesting to cover. If I can just get them back. One of them was in regards to does the panel have any suggestions for climate resilience crops that are going to yield well, but are going to be able to deal with infrequent watering, for instance, in the context of increasingly long hot summers? I would submit OCA as one example of a climate resilient crop, which is an Andean crop. Sorry, Hannah, you just unmuted. So did I interrupt you there?
No, please. I can say something after if you like.
Yeah. So just briefly, oca is in the oxalis family. It's got a lovely like lemony bite to it in the leaves. The fresh leaves can be used in salads, and then the tuber looks a bit like a new potato. Again, can be eaten raw with a nice crunch, but also cooked and mashed along with your potatoes. And that one is because of the environment in which it was cultivated, the Andean mountains. It's used to periods of drought, and I observed a very respectable crop coming off of a bed that wasn't watered at all this summer, which I think is commendable for any crop. Hannah.
Yeah, no, that's great, because I was going to say something about a bit different. But obviously, yeah, there are particular things that will do well, for example, in a long drought, and as with this idea of like unpredictability, and that actually in terms of like a resilient garden, the best thing to do is to like build in a lot of diversity of the different things that you're doing, because then if you've got some okra or you've got some tree spinach, you've got some other things that really like it really dry and hot, then they'll flourish. But then actually if you get a summer where it rains all the time, I don't want to be like a real voice of doom, but like to me that's a feature of the growing over the climate crisis, intensifying over the last 10 years. It's not it's so much less predictable, and in terms of all of the things that used to be quite predictable in terms of like yeah, just like when it was cold, when it was hot, you know, I don't think the solution is find a load of like crops that are going to fit perfectly for that scenario. I think what makes it resilient is having lots of different options, like trying out having a wide range of crops, because everything's going to affect differently, which is why obviously like monoculture is inherently like not resilient. But also I would say something about using open pollinated seeds and about saving seeds to kind of so you're creating seeds that are adapted to your particular environment, and that's actually the way to increase resilience, I would say. So obviously there's loads of really amazing seed sovereignty projects. There's then the Gaia seed sovereignty projects in London. We have the London Freedom Seed Bank. I'm sure there are other ones around as well, and that is actually, if you're getting into it, if you're sowing your own seeds and you're saving them properly, and they will be adapting as they go, and that kind of living seed library is really is really helpful.
And I'd add to Hannah's points of thinking beyond drought-resistant crops is maybe a focus on the soil, because if you have organic, rich soil heavily mulched with the ideal balance of nutrients, then that also makes your plants much more resilient to drought. You know, if there's too much nitrates in the soil, your plant will shoot up, be very lanky, and then when the drought hits, wham. So instead, if you have lower levels of nitrates, you put seaweed feed, so it grows tough and it's really well mulched, so the humidity stays in the soil, then that will be more resilient.
Nice. Cultural interventions, in addition to varietal, that of using different varieties. We have 4 more minutes, so I think perhaps we can squeeze one more question in, and I think this links quite nicely with the discussion of empowering people in their own environment rather than treating people as beneficiaries. So how do we engage our community? How do you engage your community, recruit and retain volunteers, and build capacity of people without access to green spaces? So how do we promote those opportunities and engage people in them? Darren, do you have something to say?
Oh, you spotted that I'd unmuted just in case. I'm looking again at providing technical support. So we've got a really good online system for recruiting and making offer to volunteers, but then we can't expect every small organization to be able to manage that. So what I'm putting together is a single offer, a green volunteer offer for all of the green spaces, and I'll manage that for a little while, again with the intention of handing it over to someone like CVS, so that then all smaller organizations that they don't feel comfortable accessing this technology, and quite a few of them don't, and it's the kind of thing you can expect from growers. All they need to do is tell somebody what their offer is, and then it gets out there. And also they can then share volunteers when they've got big jobs that need to do, like a green blitz or a perma blitz.
Brilliant. Does anyone else have any top tips?
We're taking a similar approach to Darren in terms of supporting community projects with volunteers if they need help. Also the Good to Grow website is so great, obviously, because I think volunteers can get involved that way. So yeah, a really nice resource there too.
Yeah, and I would also direct people to have a look at Capital Growth's summer and autumn training agenda for this year, where there's all sorts of interesting things that should be available for people growing in London. Also, to represent the work I do with social farms and gardens, we put on peer-to-peer training opportunities that specifically focus on everything that isn't growing food. So for instance, we ran one over the summer, one training, which was repeated because it was so successful, on how to run a community gardening session for volunteers. So if you're interested in either food growing or for the more organizational or cultural aspects of how to engage more people, between our organizations, we do aspire to cover the various bases. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. I'm sure Andrea, Hannah, and Prue all have interesting things to say on all of these topics, and I'd love to continue the conversation, but we're going to have to draw it to an end. So may I just finally thank the panelists so much for your brilliant interventions in this horrible, toxic food system that we live in, and creating meaningful, tangible ways in which we can engage with locally produced and sustainably produced foods. Fee, I believe you have a few closing words to make before we sign off.
Oh, I was just going to remind everyone, if you can, to fill out the survey, which Maya and Bella have just put in the chat, and remind you all that we did record this session, so we will send a link in a follow-up email to everybody, including slides from our panelists. And thank you once again to all the panelists, Darren, Hannah, Gemma, Prue and Andrea, and of course Richard for chairing today, and thanks for everyone for being so lively in the chat and participating, and yeah, it's brilliant. We had 145 people join us today, so thanks everyone, that's lovely. 300 people registered. We'll make sure that all 300 get the info from today so that folks can catch up, but looking forward to continuing these conversations through the growing season, and wishing you all luck with the start of the season. Thank you so much. Enjoy your afternoon.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.